So the presentation is Braiding the Braids, using two-eyed seeing with Indigenous and Western practices to develop best and wise practices for mental health and well-being. And we have, as part of the presentation, we have Elder Casey Eagle speaker, Dr. David Lindenbach and Dr. Gina Dimitropoulos, who've been working on this project and for quite a while now. And I'm really, really eager to hear what they have to share with us. Um, Elder Casey's speaker is a Blackfoot elder and member of the Gina Nation in southern Alberta. He's also known by his traditional name, Sorrel Horse, by his people within the Blackfoot Confederation. Elder Casey Speaker has been working at Hull Services since 1998 and was honored as the first elder of Hull Services in 2025. He's the lead elder for Braiding the Sweetgrass program at Hull Services, and you'll hear about it soon, and has played a major role in designing the program. David Lindenbach is the Director of Research at Hull Services and an adjunct professor of psychiatry at University of Calgary. He was born in Toronto and is of mixed European descent with ancestors from Ireland, England, France, Germany, and Romania. He leads a community-based research program into youth mental health and child trauma, and he focuses on bringing together academics, community providers, and people with lived experience to perform pragmatic studies that address real-world problems. And I was lucky to be part of one such gathering last year. And Gina Dimitropoulos is a professor of social work in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. She's the co-lead research scientist at Hull Services. She's also the research lead for Alberta's IYS initiative. She brings experience and knowledge in youth mental health, including eating disorders, peer support, and integrated and transitions in care.
Okay. Nisrango Gochimiotas. Nichikanak at six kakwan. You heard I am Sore Horse. My income tax name is Casey Eagle Speaker. I'm a grandfather of 26, great grandfather of, well, we'll say 17 because October 1st is when the 17th great grandchild comes into the world. So I remember the Kainai Nation. My mother was from the Siksika Nation. My father was from the Kainai Nation, formerly known as the Blood Tribe. My ancestry also goes back to the Hunkpapa Aglala Sioux through Akasakapiotasi, many white horses. So, but I'll leave it at that because I can go back 23 generations and we won't have time for any presentations. So I've been employed with Hull since 98. Actually, I started half-time in 97 with them. And 14 years ago, 2014 demonstration around NMT and Indigenous ways was brought to the forefront to see what could be done. And we put our application in, we're accepted for that. But it was an understanding that we could not follow the Western way of doing, but to follow the Indigenous ways of doing, but blending the two together, braiding the strength of each and bring them into a whole. So following our ways is looking at working with individuals is a Western model. Braiding the Sweetgrass was working with whole families, from a child to young people to the parents, grandparents, and we've had them all. And we made sure that the program itself would have the flexibility because of Indigenous ways that nothing can be written in stone, that we flow with the dynamics of the family. Our goal at that time is that there's 3 levels identified, that we have our people who are searching to reconnect to culture, others who are immersed in culture, and others who are in total denial. So we went down the middle to look for those who are searching. And also recruiting elders from each of the Treaty 7 nations here to look at that, and also other elders from other parts. We have Métis elders and Cree elders, all heavily involved in what we do. But it was a way of looking at intergenerational trauma, the effects, and how did that begin? Understanding that it's not just the individual, but the whole the whole nation of Indigenous people has been traumatized through residential school, as well as other effects such as oppression, oppressive and restrictive policies. But Braiding the Sweetgrass is to connect with them, to go to that brave space and to have that place where they are able to speak and to reconnect, to understand where transmission points of trauma were, and to understand what trauma is through the Indigenous lens. What we do is we have a therapist that comes in from the NMT who talks about that, and I parallel that with the Indigenous ways of looking. So using that, we say the two-eyed seeing approach. And as we look at it, that we do not run the program on a strict time limit with any of our programs that we do. The leaders or the staff that we have will form an outline of what they would like to see happen that night, but we don't put a time limit on it because I often tell them once the elders get a hold of that, you flow with the elders. You'll get what we need. You'll hear the stories, but in that are the teachings. But we start off by have an introductory feast with all the families, children, young people, introducing elders and going through that, and families introduce themselves to elders. And during the feast, the elders are mingling with all the families, creating that relationship with each and every one of them. And that's the first gathering. So there's always a feast. Food is a very important part because of our ways of being, knowing, and doing. As we often say, the four elements of sustaining life is food, water, air, and the sun, and the air that we breathe. So everything is there. So the following one is what we call our storytelling, bringing that to the forefront for all the families, talking about creation stories that they've never heard. Many have never heard that, or even the story of Scarface and Blackfoot about where the ceremonies of the sweat lodge, the pipe, the red ochre, and the smudge come from. Establishing a foundation for them that are going on a journey of discovery, but during this journey to see where the disruptions were and how we can break the cycle of interracial trauma, and going with that and saying, this is who we are as human beings, our ways of being, knowing, doing. There's land-based point two where we take them out on the land to reconnect to the land, spending a day out there, teaching some of the elders that we select from each of those ones that we've recruited. So we rotate our elders in that same way, but talking about the land, talking about who we are and how we believe in that. So this is what I'm looking at and saying, this is who we are. So I know at the early stages was drum making was a part of it for the young people, and the story of the drumming, what the drum symbolizes. So they got deeply connected to that. And our way of teaching, so we have our third session 3 coming up, introductory to legacy education. And that's really talking about the residential school. And we do it age appropriately. We have ones for the children, one for our young adults, and then we have ones for the adults themselves. So each one is not to traumatize them, but to get the teaching of what happened. So maybe the little ones will learn about grandmother's red shoes. It's based upon that. And our young people are taught about the effects of what residence school did. They don't hear the deep, dark stories, but they hear about the abusive patterns that happened. The adults will get that heavy laden stories. So elders like myself will talk about our story of residence school and our experiences. And I don't sugarcoat anything I experienced in residence school because that needs to be heard. And the effects, but also teaching them that where I had to come from by using culture, using ceremonies, using stories, and reconnecting. And then we have one a couple weeks later, what we call is still the legacy education, where more stories come out. But we follow that by where I run a sweat lodge. Right after that session, we go into a sweat lodge to go through that journey, that journey of healing, to get that place of well-being, connecting all that, and connecting and understanding that connection, interconnection, that once the ceremony starts, we have a portal to the spirit world. So explaining all that, I have an elder who will actually go through that, and then I run the ceremony. So this is a part of what we do, but it's an important part of how our young people are dealt with. Because the way we believe is that in order for our young people to get to that place of well-being is to reconnect to who they are. Culture is going to be the mainstay and how we do that. We're looking at their minds, as we've often stated, they are the experts of the now and the leaders of tomorrow, and it's how we guide them. And it's through our program that they start understanding the powers that they have, the strengths that they have, that they don't have to be like anybody else, but to create themselves. Understanding that the connection to parents, that broken tie that happened since residential school started, being removed from parents. So that tie, and I talk about my story and how that happened in my family. But it's also a journey, them understanding that that this is a journey that we need to take. We have our cultural acceptance course in that too. Self-identity. As I use mirrors for that one. Yeah, it's an experiential exercise that they look at. Talking about who they are and really getting away from the words about being Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, Indian, First Nations, and going back to what they connect with is their true identity. They need that. So if they're Cree from, say, we had one come in from Saskatchewan, and I said, okay, you're a Plains Cree. You're a Plains Cree woman. And I told her, can you say that? And she did. And the people observed that, the other families there, the other adults that were there, noticed something shift when she was able to say she was a Plains Cree woman from the Red Pheasant Nation. And that's when they realized that going back to what our true identities does not carry the shame. It does not carry the stereotypes, but it brings back that dignity and a sense of pride. And that was important for them to start doing that. The mirror exercise, that be able to take that mirror and look in that mirror for the first time and to talk to themselves. Even that simple thing of looking in the mirror and saying, I love you. You are a young Plains Cree woman. You belong to this nation. They belong to me. That shift of the mindset, because what we're doing is we're trying to unlearn what has been embedded to us through the residential school system. Because it is learned behavior, learned mentality, learned spirituality, learned physical ways of being. So unlearning all this. And I talk about that, and it's really heavily laden about that residential school aspect. Talking about, yes, we were taught that everything about us is wrong. The color of our skin, our language, our spiritual practices, that were unworthy, undeserving. And that was deeply embedded in our people. I was the seventh generation in my family to go through that. Thankfully, my grandchildren, great-grandchildren never have to experience it. But it's really establishing that and saying, this is what we are. Braiding the Sweetgrass, as I described to them at the beginning, that every strand, every straw is uniquely one of a kind. Each has its own strength. It's only when we braid them together that we have ultimate strength. And as people, when we can do that and bring back what we are through understanding culture, understanding their own culture, going through ceremonies, but hearing through the Indigenous lens of what trauma is to our people, identifying that, taking back what is truly theirs and deserving of it. So everything is purposeful in how we do that. And the elders are at every level involved in what we do. Like I'll give them, when we meet, I'll tell them this is where we're going with this thing, and we need what you have. So it's interesting that, and following our ways is that even when we're doing storytelling, children are still playing. And I remember some parents were going to correct their children. We just told them, no, it's okay. They have ears. Let them be children. Because that's in residence school, you weren't allowed to be a child. Let them be children. And they did that. And they start realizing that after a while, when the kids were at home talking about what they heard in the stories, that the parents start realizing it's okay to let them be children. They're still hearing. They don't have to sit still and look forward with their eyes open and not anything else. Nothing so, I guess, militarist in a military style. Teaching parents about perfectionism is not our way. And that was learned behavior in residence schools. All these little components that we start seeing that's happening. An example of this last cohort, when one young lady was saying that she was having issues with her son. And he's 12 years old. I said, I don't know what's happened ever since we had this new one. We disconnected. I said, what do you normally do? He says, well, I'm always hugging the baby, saying I love him. He says, what about your son? He says, well, it just stopped. I said, so when did it stop for you as you grew up in your family? And light bulb comes up, well, that stopped when I turned 12 too. I said, there's your transmission point of what happened. I told him, importantly, there's nothing wrong with your family. There's nothing wrong with your parents or anybody else. So what happened to them? And that's an important message in Braiding the Sweetgrass. There's nothing wrong with Indigenous people. It's about what happened to them and still continue to happen today. And connecting to culture. Part of what we do is we also take the program and moved it to continuing community, following our Indigenous ways, that once you get people into a place of well-being, you don't just stop. You must maintain that connection. You must continue with that walk with them. So continuing communities are cohorts that we've had since we first started up to the present. So it's growing. And so we have programmings that we continue connecting with them, continue with that support. We just don't cut it off. And like we said, it's the whole families. So, and we don't exclude anybody. We've had non-Indigenous families who've come in who are fostering children, Indigenous children, and connecting them with that. And even they had wake-up calls. So there's nothing that we would say that you can look at the program. I think it's the best way to describe the program itself is that you would have to go through it to feel the experience. It's like going through a ceremony of a sweat lodge. People can talk about the mechanics, but the true experience is when you actually go through it, and then you really can't explain how that works other than just accepting. And the families that we have are still connected to us. I mean, I still get that point where these young men, young women, our youth that were back then beginning are adults now who are coming back and saying, if I had not gone through the program and taken back my true identity and understood the trauma that my whole family went through and how it was transmission, not knowing that was being handed down to us, normalizing negative behaviors, negative thoughts. All of these things were coming up to surface, bringing that to the surface for them to take a look at that is not who they are. Following the indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing, and looking at the NMT model. I know Dr. Bruce Perry often talks about that when he spoke on that at a forum in Banff where we both spoke, and he said, what is so new to brain science is ancient knowledge amongst the indigenous people. In the video that he helped put together, what we've always known, and that's what we've done, is using the knowledge of our people and bring it back to them because they truly need that. This is what they belong to, and it belongs to them. I don't push the Blackfoot culture on them, but I do push the fact that there's healthy elders, people in their communities that they know. Connecting those, so the continuing community is connecting those dots on a continuing basis for them, and them creating a community with themselves. So continuing communities, but creating community was another part of our work in Braiding the Sweetgrass. That's towards the end. In building community, what are the resources where families are actually talking with each other more openly? They have this health relationship. They talk about resourcing, and so they start building community by sharing resources with each other. Where can you find this help at? So you say it's the whole family. We don't deal with just one. We go with that understanding that a community raises a child. Well, when you look at that, it's the whole family is the child. In the Blackfoot way we look at that, it's the whole family. When they're struggling, we don't take the one out. We need to work with them because there's trauma being experienced within that family itself. And to take one piece out does not work. It only instills more trauma to the whole family. It's more disruptive. So we work with the whole family. We don't take reports on any of them because this is all strictly voluntary. They don't have child welfare involvement. They don't have any legal matters that's involved. These are people who are truly looking to reconnect to culture, to truly start walking in a good way with a clean, healthy mind, or a clean, healthy way of being. And we've seen great success with them. We still have people are still referring back to if this would not happen. We've had one family who their mother actually ran for a councillor position here in the city of Calgary during that time. The journey that took her to that place, unafraid, unashamed. If we can do that for our young people, to get them to that point of understanding trauma, not only from the Western lens, but through the Indigenous lens, and going through a program that guides that process, but they have the ultimate choice. It's purposeful on how we do things. The staffing of Braiding the Sweetgrass right now are so accustomed to knowing that I have a schedule, but it's only a guide. I cannot follow that in stone. They must also understand that the elders are going to lead that, but they just need a bit of a guide to look at to say, okay, now I know what to do. And they each will take their journey, the families on this journey. And each of them they're constantly expressing the gratitude of their families being there. To hear what needs to be shared with them so that the history of the people can continue forward, to bring more hope for tomorrow for the families. We've had one young lady, and She identified as being male, which we had no issues with. And ceremony, she understood ceremony, and she's a musician. And we brought her a couple times back to talk to young people about the program. So it's using that continuing community to bring certain people in to share a bit of their journey with the new ones. So it's really creating a space of just being a human being to say, I am. As I said, I am Sawhorse, a member of the Kainai Nation. To hear these families be able to say that, this is who I am. These are my people. Connecting back to what is true in their hearts and removing the learned behaviors, learned mentalities, learned spiritual ways, learned physical ways of being. Because as we take them through that process of understanding trauma, they start realizing that drugs, alcohol, self-harm are no longer tools that they need to look at. It's understanding that they are now being centered in their mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical ways of being centered in that. And they're taught that that circle of life is that's the best it'll ever be, to be centered. And that in all four elements, there's a constant flux between the four. They're never going to be solid. It tells they learn that, yes, it's okay to make mistakes as long as I can accept them, because they become my teachers. They learn to forgive themselves and how they've been reacting to others who may have done the harm to them in the past. Part of my story, and the way they hear that, when they hear the end, says, the greatest teachers I've had are the 5 men and the 1 woman, all that damage they've done to me in residence school. It's that they are now my greatest teachers on how not to treat a fellow human being. I told them that journey because I had to forgive this person first on how I was reacting, and then go back and forgive them. That's a part of Braiding the Sweetgrass journey, is understanding that I need to forgive me. To unlearn, I need to forgive myself. And it's through culture, ceremonies, teachings, stories that they can find that. It's also understanding what trauma is, how intergenerational, what that looks like. So they're taught that, but they're also taught, as part of my talk on that, is we cannot blame non-Indigenous people of today. They were not there. And I'll share this with you, that what they hear when I tell them, when resident schools started when they became mandatory in 1920, mind you, they've been around for 160 years anyhow, but 1920 became mandatory, and everything that we were taught about ourselves was being taught to non-Indigenous school children. Exactly the same thing about us. So it's a road that, and if you want to look at the 2 rivers, both sides were lied to about Indigenous people. So now is the time that we start saying, now let's get to the truth about the beings, the human beings. Let's understand that we can unlearn those 4 elements that trauma has instilled in us. It's not an impossible journey. And they hear that when I first meet with the families. This is not an impossible journey. It's a challenge for you to allow yourself to be real again, to be true. Elders are here to support you. Elders are here to guide. The staff is here to maintain the connections, to continue braiding that sweetgrass together, bringing the strength in each and every one of you represent. They also understand that each of them is uniquely one of a kind from the stories that we carry. Stories about being that you cannot be like anybody else. The fallacy that you should be more like your brother, sister, uncle, friend are untrue. You can never be because they already exist. It's about them creating themselves, and the families that we deal with around trauma and understanding it, connecting to culture, connecting to stories and ceremonies, is how they are creating themselves. They're not thinking that there's something mentally wrong or physically or spiritually or emotionally wrong with them anymore. Understanding that they've always had this place that need to be guided back to who they are within their heart. And it's through the cultural practices that we do this. So thank you. So I think I get turned over to David and Gina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elder Casey, for starting us off in a good way with the prayer, and also the beautiful story of how Braiding the Sweetgrass started, and the ongoing work that you continue to do that has such an impact on young people, families, and communities. So I feel I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to hear you present, as I'm sure many other people have as well today. I'm going to start by presenting, and then I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Lindenbach. So I feel very grateful again to be presenting with Elder Casey and Dr. Lindenbach, but I want to I feel privileged because we're really presenting on behalf of a very big community of people who have been involved in supporting some of the work that we're going to be sharing today, including a number of other elders, researchers, and the many people at Health Services who have been collaborating and helping us to think about and reflect and learn. So this is a community of people who have really helped us to come to this place where we are today, and we're continuing to learn. And even today, I've already learned so much, and all of you have will probably share with us some new insights that we'll incorporate into some of what we're doing as well at Health Services. This Health Services, if anyone has an opportunity to come out to Alberta and spend some time with Elder Casey and Dr. Lindenbach and the other people at Hall, you will be blown away by the beauty of the campus, and also the incredible work that's being done at Hall Services. This is an organization that provides care to over 8,000 clients a year, and provides care to from 0 to 24 to communities, to caregivers and communities. There are over 28 programs, 600 plus staff and growing. And as Elder Casey mentioned, the overarching framework that guides the work that's done at Hall Services, the Neurosequential Model. There's lots of different programs that are offered, everything from prevention to early intervention, specialized services. There's services that are embedded within the school system. There's a therapeutic campus, services for young adults. There's some education and training that's done as well. So it's just a wonderful organization. And since Dr. Lindenbach joined as the research lead at Hall Services, so much more research is being done with great humility, making sure that it's culturally sensitive and responsive to also acknowledging the parallel process. So I just want to make a shout out to Dr. Lindenbach for all his work that he's been doing and the research at Hall Services as well. I'm going to just take a few moments to talk a little bit, and I feel like this is going to be a bit of a sharp contrast from what you've been hearing so far, because it's going to sound very Western, and I'm going to be using language that's going to be a little bit jarring, but important to just give a context for some of the work that we've done. So, as many of you know that most mental health problems have their onset in childhood, and developing a mental health problem, concern, issue, disorder in early childhood puts many young people at risk of developing more mental health problems later in life. And there is research that suggests that 75% of young people likely have a co-occurring mental health problem. So they may have anxiety, depression, substance use, high rates of suicidality, self-harm. So we're seeing that, young people are not how they're presenting in a variety of different settings. They're not presenting with an issue that can be nicely fit into a diagnostic diagnosis like anxiety disorder. They're usually, there's lots of complexity and lots of layers. And as someone just asked in their question and the comments I heard, often we don't think about people's identities and cultures when we're so over focused on diagnosis. And often we're also seeing young people in various settings who are from working with people who are children all the way to adults. And we're also seeing young people who are presenting in multiple settings as well. I guess the good news in some ways is that over the last 50, 60 years, there's been a proliferation of lots of evidence-based treatments to support young people with mental health issues. But unfortunately, many of them, or fortunately, depending on both can exist at the same time, is that often they're designed to only address a singular mental health issue. Like you'll have an evidence-based treatment that's designed to help people with anxiety or depression or eating disorders. And even within eating disorders, because that's my area, you have so many different manuals and evidence-based treatments for the different kinds of eating disorders. And what this has done is it's created a workforce. I think it's created an access problem and a problem for our mental health workforce to really have the bandwidth to be able to learn about all these different modalities. And it makes it really difficult when you're a mental health provider to really feel like you're informed about all these different mental health problems to support young people in a good way. And often organizations don't have the funding to be able to provide such intensive services for lots of different models of care. And that's where the Unified Protocol comes in. So the Unified Protocol is a transdiagnostic approach for addressing emotional disorders in children and adolescents. And the founder of this model is Dr. Jill Eichenreich, and she is a world leader in really encouraging us to think about how to support young people who are presenting with lots of different mental health issues and emotional disorders. And what she and her colleagues have done is distill what are really the core ingredients of cognitive behavioral therapy. And what she and her colleagues have found is that they often are about learning how to identify your emotions, how to label your emotions, and also how to engage in emotion behaviors in a way that is adaptive and helps people to address their concerns in a way that's adaptive rather than avoiding, because we all avoid when our emotions are really hard and really intense, or we engage in behaviors that sometimes can be really problematic and hurtful to our body, to our spirit. And we have had the privilege as a group of working with Jill to adapt the Unified Protocol for emerging adults, and over the years have done lots of research particularly at Hall Services, where we've taken the model, we've tested it within the school system with young people who have significant trauma histories, and then we've also been testing the model in the campus services and also in another context. But that's for really another talk. There's lots of benefits to a transdiagnostic approach, which I've talked a little bit about. It really helps to reduce the training burden on therapists. It helps us to think about how to help young people who are presenting with lots of different issues, but also may change over time. So we're not like rigidly holding on to one approach that we're using when young people are often changing, and there's different complexities that are shared. So as I mentioned, Dr. Lindenbach and I and others have been really working hard to think about how to adapt the UP protocol in a number of different ways. And we're really happy to share some of that work with all of you as well. And during the pandemic, we thought a lot about how this has been just developed through a Western and very Eurocentric lens. And some of the language that we're using is not culturally sensitive. It's how do we really think about how to support young people at hall services. I want to mention that hall services serves over 30% of the young people who are receiving care are Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit. We wanted to think about how do we do better and work in parallel with elders and Indigenous scholars to carefully think about how do we take what works in the Western context and think about what would we need to do different in an Indigenous parallel. So we have been working closely with Elder Casey and many other elders over the years to really think carefully about this. And what we're going to do today is share with you some of those learnings and then open it up for discussion. So I just want to share with you some of the things that I've learned and that we've all learned and we're thinking a lot about as we really think about the parallel process and how we can bring some of this to the work that Braiding the Sweetgrass is doing with children, young people, and communities. And some of the things that I want to highlight is we heard a lot about the impact of residential school on people and the numbing, the devastating effect it has on those who attend residential schools. That survivors may be unable to recognize, to identify, to experience their emotions because they've become numb to survive the horrendous traumas that they experienced. And that this numbness, the traumas that were experienced by residential schools, and I would argue the ongoing traumas that are occurring by ongoing cultural violence and colonization will take 7 generations for us to recover, for Indigenous people to recover from. There's significant unresolved trauma and mental health issues that continue to haunt Indigenous people through spirits. Some people often will stay stuck in their trauma from childhood and never feel like they can move on beyond it. And there are many people who need to learn how to love themselves and then how to love others. Because if you can't love yourself first, you'll never be able to, and be good to yourself, you'll never be able to be good to anyone else. We also learned that trauma is a sensory experience, and that unlike the CBT model that I just talked about, that healing starts with the senses, and one way to be able to access the senses is through ceremonies like smudging and drumming and feasts, and really connecting to the land. And that Indigenous people connect to their spirit and their ancestors as a way to heal from the traumas that they experience. So you can't start with the cognitions and the thinking, that you start from the sensory experiences, and that is an important way to start the healing process. So we also have learned about the importance of telling. We can provide counseling using practices that encourage people to think about identity, culture, and that recently there was a story that was shared about a jingle dress with a girl while telling her stories, and she was creating a jingle dress while telling her stories and teachings about her traditional ways and fulfilling her grandmother role. Just a few more sharings, and then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Lindenbach. We've also learned from many of the academics, Indigenous scholars that we have had the privilege of working with, that personality traits that differ from the norm often are considered disorders in the Western way, but they are not considered that in the Indigenous parallel process. They're seen as a gift that was given by the spirits, and that can be really beneficial if used appropriately and properly. And sometimes the tools that we are providing through services and treatments, they're not necessarily the problem, but the problem is the way that we're asking people to use those tools. We've also heard about the way that we evaluate programs in a Western way, and the funding and the funders positions that are placed on how we are asked to do evaluations are really not respectful to Indigenous ways. I mean, currently having that it's important to have people tell their stories as directed by their elders, and often they share their stories in ceremony, and we're not taking notes, and it's not appropriate to be documenting the stories that people are sharing through ceremony, which again really challenges the Western lens, which requires documentations and frequencies, and it's just not culturally appropriate to be collecting data in that way, and extracting and appropriating people's stories. And often when people get dysregulated, as a child, one of the Indigenous scholars spoke about when I would get dysregulated as a child, my grandfather had me rub a beaver pelt until I calmed down. And this activity could be described as a traditional Indigenous practice or a modern Western cognitive behavioral therapy approach, and both are accurate. And so now I'll turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Lindenbach, and I can manage the slides, David, if you'd like.
Yeah, sounds good. So, yeah, we also talked a little bit to some people at Hull Services to get, and Elder Casey talked a little bit about this already, about how the Braiding the Sweetgrass program is an experience rather than, a program itself, and that it looks to address the root causes of intergenerational trauma. And that people are often inspired by the journeys of elders through hardships. So we heard about a few when we kind of described some of the cognitive behavioral therapy pieces. We heard a few things about somebody commenting that praying for people we hurt who hurt you is a way that we do something called opposite action. Elder Casey was talking about that earlier, actually, and that certain terms like mindfulness is maybe it's a very Western term and is maybe not the best way to describe sort of the approach of Indigenous peoples here. So if you want to, especially because we need to sort of be more in action than just aware. So if you want to go to the next slide here, Gina, I'll start to. Actually, right now, I'd like to mention Elder Casey would like to offer you a gift a gift and some tobacco as a thank you for speaking to us today. So I'd be happy to walk over to your office and give that to you in a few minutes after we're done here. Just to thank you for your time. Really appreciate the words that you shared and the wisdom that you shared throughout this project. So we'd like to, with this last section, kind of braid the braids and really try to pull together some of the strands that we talked about today and share with you the last bit of, or kind of the current draft of the protocol that we have for this program. It is very much what you're going to see today is very much the draft that exists on September 26, 2025. It's a work in progress. And you'll see that some parts are a bit more fleshed out than others. So the idea would be that each session of this program would be co-facilitated by at least one elder and at least one expert in the unified protocol. And that's consistent with how a lot of stuff is done within Braiding the Sweetgrass when they're introducing some Western ideas. So they might have a Western therapist come in and talk a little bit about the neurosequential model, and then somebody like Casey would help kind of interpret that from an Indigenous lens. And one of the things, that you heard Casey talk about earlier today is this idea that from the perspective of First Nations people and from many Métis people as well, the circle of life, sometimes known as the medicine wheel, is really foundational to thinking about wellness, right? And that wellness comes from a combination of the spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional. And then so we started thinking about, well, what are the parallels with the unified protocol? What are some ways that the unified protocol might align with this? And it just so happens that our team has, as Gina was documenting or talking about, we've done some work with adapting the unified protocol at Whole Services and other places in Alberta. And so we've actually created like a brief 4 to 5 session version that tries to boil down what we consider to kind of be the four key components of the unified protocol. Maybe even the 4 key components of CBT, although cognitive behavioral therapy more generally, although I won't necessarily claim to know that. And that's exemplified by the figure in the bottom right here that shows the connection between feelings, behavior, and thoughts, right? I have feelings in my body, I have thoughts in my head, I have behaviors that I act, and those things, they do have their own separate properties, but they're also related to each other. And if you change one, it changes the other. So when we think about kind of how the circle of life might fit with that, in one sense, I think what we show here in sessions 2, 3, and 4 in the bottom middle there, the alignment between emotional and feelings, mental and thoughts, physical and behaviors, that is perhaps a bit more straightforward. In English, they're kind of synonyms. The first one, the connection of spiritual, was something that, at least for me, was a bit harder to wrap my head around. I mean, I've come to learn that spirituality in this context doesn't mean spirits. To the best of my understanding, it seems to refer to interconnection, interrelatedness, coordinated action, that kind of thing. And when it's framed that way, it starts to sound like one of the things we emphasize actually usually in the first session of talking about the unified protocol, which is to get people to, start to understand that your feelings, your thoughts, and your behaviors are connected to each other. And that you can look at them separately, and we do in some sessions, but you also need to view them holistically because they influence each other. So this is the overall draft of the 4 sessions. I'd like to kind of go into those sessions a little bit more detail. If you can go to the next slide, Gina. So in session 1, the spiritual component. So these sessions are designed to be about 2.5 hours each. And there's the welcoming, introduction, feasting that Elder Casey talked about, the importance of feasting earlier. And then in part 2, we have people create, or we're going to have people create, this is what they view as, so we have this analogy that Casey referred to a little bit. He came up with this analogy of this idea that imagine we're kind of floating on a river in a boat, and on one riverbank we have the Western riverbank, and that has the Western ways. And then on the other riverbank, there is the Indigenous riverbank. And we are on a boat because the riverbanks, when you're on a river, the riverbanks are what guide you, right, and direct you. And so imagine that we are on this boat traveling down this river and observing what's going on the different riverbanks and trying to identify where things are similar and where there are parallels. And so we thought we'd have people start out to think about what, as one of the open activities, if you had to draw this or create it using 3D materials, construction materials like clay or something, how would you create the river? How would you create the boat? If you're wondering where these images come from, by the way, I was feeding some of the text that we've been working on into Microsoft Copilot and asking it to generate some images. So the images are what our future AI overlords think that the riverbanks and boats should look like. But I don't know anything about boating and whether that looks like a plausible way to construct a boat. But anyway, I thought they were kind of cool. And so that's kind of part two. People will describe what they think the riverbanks and the boats look like to them. And probably at the very end, when we're done with all the sessions, maybe have people describe this again, create it again, describe it again, and see if how they describe it has changed. So in the third part, we'll have elder teachings and then unified protocol teachings. You're really kind of diving more into the content where we're connecting the circle of life with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So I'll give an example of like when I'm facilitating unified protocol sessions of how I would facilitate this from a Western perspective. One example that we often use with thoughts, feelings, and behaviors is, let's say you get invited to a party and you're a little nervous and you start to think, gee, what if I don't know anybody there? What if I start to feel weird if I don't have anybody to talk to? Maybe that'd be kind of awkward. People would be looking at me, right? And then those thoughts in your head might start to provoke certain feelings in your body. Maybe your stomach starts turning in knots, your hands are sweaty, your heart starts pounding quickly, right? And then that might cause certain behaviors. Maybe you find an excuse not to go. You text your friend and say, oh, sorry, I'm busy. This thing came up. I'm sick, right? And so we can see how our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors influence each other. So that's an example that I'll often use when facilitating the unified protocol. And so we then have people have our participants, our families, identify situations that are challenging for them and how it impacts them physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, to get people used to the idea of starting to think about how they're doing in terms of these different components and how these components relate to each other. And then for the fourth part, we'd like to have people actually create their own circle of life. And so, there's 4 sessions, 4 quadrants to the circle of life. And so at the end of this session focusing on spirituality, people will fill in that quadrant and talk about what it means to them and how they're going to use these teachings. Go to the next slide there, Gina. So I was mentioning this is a very much a September 26, 2025 draft. The rest of it is a bit more sketched out, but not as well fleshed out, perhaps. It's a bit more kind of ideas at this point. But session 2, the idea is it would focus on the emotional component. So, from an Indigenous perspective, when talking with different elders and knowledge keepers, we heard so much about the importance of ceremonies and cultural activities to bring people into the present moment. Whether it's the smudge that Elder Casey led at the beginning here, or if we're doing a pipe ceremony or the sweat lodge, or, just beading, that those are, it's about being present in the moment, but it's also about acting in the present moment. And from a Western perspective, if we're facilitating unified protocol sessions, we might have people do something like, close your eyes and just focus on one thing that you can hear, or let's focus on the sound of our breath, that kind of thing. So it's grounding people in the present moment. It is little bit diverse. I'm trying not to use the word different here because Casey has cautioned me not to. It's kind of hard though. So both knowledge systems are recognizing the value of staying present in the moment. The Indigenous ways are involving a bit more of hands-on activities, doing stuff. The Western way is a bit more passive observation, but it's getting you to the same place, right? It's very much the idea of parallel paths that lead you to the same or similar place. Go to the next slide there, Gina. So session 3, it's an interesting one, looking at the mental components of things. So this is one that I personally found quite challenging, but interesting. So, when we think about from the unified protocol perspective, when we teach this, it's very logical and kind of rational. So we'll have people, let's say, maybe use an analogy of, you don't get invited to some event that your friends are doing and you're feeling left out and you're thinking, my friends are jerks. They're so mean. I can't believe I wasn't invited to this. From a unified protocol perspective, we might start to talk about, well, do we know why we weren't invited? maybe our friends are jerks and they hate us, but maybe there's other things going on. Like, what are some other possible reasons that this might have happened? Let's work through the different possibilities, right? It's logical, it's rational, it's a bit more individual, and kind of focusing on you as an individual. And so, in talking about these ideas with different elders and knowledge keepers, a few things were brought up of kind of ways that Indigenous people could process these kinds of things, or are taught to process these things. So there's the Blackfoot 11 sacred values has come up, this being Blackfoot territory that we're on, that I'm on anyway, that we're developing this on. There's also the Anishinaabe 7 grandfather teachings. It's not necessarily Anishinaabe territory, but the 7 grandfather teachings seem to be quite widely used. And those teachings seem to be a bit more kind of relational and communal. So might, in this scenario of feeling excluded by our friends, start to focus on things like, how do the feelings of anger that you have and the angry thoughts, how does that impact your relations with your friends and with your mutual friends, right? And how is this impacting the health and strength of your community with the thoughts and the actions that you're having, right? And so I think for a while, I was kind of thinking, well, the unified protocol is kind of like logical and rational and individual here, and the Indigenous ways are a bit more kind of relational and communal. Doesn't that sound different? But I think there's a way to kind of bring it together in the sense that both knowledge systems are providing tools to help us think about the world in new ways, to explore new perspectives, and to live in harmony. And I think that last piece is key, right? It's giving you tools to help you live in harmony with the people around you. It's again, I think we're kind of taking separate paths that are leading us to a similar spot. Go to the next slide. So then session 4 on the physical component, this is one where from a Western perspective, there's behavioral experiments. The unified protocol talks about what are different activities that you can engage in if you're feeling dysregulated or stressed out. What can you do? And so it proposes a few different activities. I think there's 5, but we show 4 here. Social activities, fun activities, mastery activities, and service activities. Things you can try to help you feel better. And these are quotes that what is the text for unified protocol is pulled directly from the manual. And I remember when we were talking with Elder Evelyn Goodstriker, who's a Dakota elder, about this, she was looking at this and saying, this looks a lot like the Circle of Courage, which was first proposed by Martin Brokenleg and a few others, Martin Brokenleg being Lakota, and a few others about 20 years ago. And they were trying to look across cultures and trying to decide, what do all kids need to develop in a healthy way? And they came up with these 4 quadrants of the circle with something they called the Circle of Courage that includes belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. And if you look at the text of what's written under the unified protocol activities and the Circle of Courage, it's very similar. We're still not, this isn't fully fleshed out, but what we might do is maybe ask people to come up with one activity in each quadrant that they could engage in when they're feeling dysregulated to help them feel better. Go to the next slide there. I think this is the last slide. So as a future direction, so we do need to complete the first draft of our protocol, and then facilitate the first cohort of Braiding the Sweetgrass, and then start to adjust it based on what we've learned in the first cohort. And there's actually a parallel here. So what I've written here is, or what we've written here is that it's similar to the learning health system model, where we're kind of iteratively making adaptations. But as Elder Casey was talking about earlier, with kind of Blackfoot notions of flux and nothing really being complete, there's even a parallel here, the Western learning health system with Blackfoot notions of flux. So thank you very much.